I'm a segregationist, okay? I believe that God has commanded me not to mix with other races.
Racial tensions in America have always been a significant issue. You can't talk about America without mentioning all the different races that make it up. The American people have gone through years of racial issues, dating back to when there was slavery and even back to when the white European settlers met the brown Native American tribes. Slavery may have ended in the 1800s, but its consequences are still alive today in 2019. After slavery, there was segregation, and the pain and suffering of segregation still lives on to this day. What's crazier is that some folks still see segregation as a great problem today, hence the Troost wall.
And so we still feel that today, even though technically we say that we are desegregated. But as far as investment and in what is seen as a asset to the community, a lot of times the areas where we see people of color are in higher density aren't as celebrated, aren't as seen as beautiful.
Troost Avenue has been one of the largest racial and wealth dividing lines in America. It divides the whites from the blacks and the rich from the poor. Along the Paseo corridor and further east is where the poverty-stricken minorities live, while everything west of Troost is mainly populated by the rich and wealthy white folk. Let's take a step back to where it all started. In 1934, the construction of Troost Avenue began. Troost Avenue is named after Benoist Troost.
He was the son-in-law of what was probably the wealthiest man in early Kansas City, William Gillis. And Benoist Troost himself was a dentist, but his wealth, and the only reason that the street's named after him, is because his wife was a niece. I said his father-in-law, it's his uncle-in-law. His niece, William Gillis, who's the wife of Benoist Troost, was the heir to most of the Gillis fortune.
Soon after, Troost Avenue became home to Millionaires Row. Millionaires Row would eventually come to an end when the economy crashed in the 1890s. This would start it all. Around that time, most African Americans lived at the West Bottoms, but due to the Second Industrial Revolution, along with the expansion of railroads, they were driven out. And white home settlers were desperate to make money, so they opened up to selling their homes to African Americans. In the 1920s, the whites started to become more concerned about property values, and soon in 1923, the city council passed new zoning ordinances. This was more than likely motivated by racism, and therefore helped keep the blacks on the east side of Troost. At this time, segregation was still legal, but in 1954, the Supreme Court ruled that all schools should continue not to be segregated. This was a huge win for the civil rights movement, or at least it sounded like it was. The Kansas City School District at the time was all white in 1954. They did not resist the Supreme Court's new ruling, but they did find a way around it. They created new boundary lines, and Troost was the obvious choice to put one since it was heavily segregated already.
Basically, the division in terms of school districts, and this was another way in which this broke down, not high school districts, but grade school districts. And I think you've done some research with regard to some of the grade schools. Now, historically, until after Brown versus Board of Education, which was 1954, the elementary districts were divided among the white schools and the black schools, and you had different boundaries, in many that overlapped, in fact, in certain cases. But you would have strictly African American children going to the black schools, and you'd have strictly white children going to the white schools. As they readjusted boundaries.
What happened in the 1900s still affects the city now. Troost Avenue still has a west side full of whites and an east side full of blacks.
Well, the fact that the Troost and the Paseo area have been a racial division area for now upwards of 100 years.
Places like churches have also played a key role in segregation.
I think it was Dr. Martin Luther King who said that the most segregated hour in America is at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning.
However, there are plenty of people trying to bring life and opportunity to the east side of the community. People like Kimmitt Coleman, an urbanist, activist, and vice president of the Troost Market Collective.
Yeah, so I consider myself an urbanist, and that's really just somebody who is interested in like the built environment and the way that humans interact with it. So I'm fascinated with the way that people manage real estate, the way that they perceive real estate, everything from transportation to infrastructure. And so like I feel like because my perspective is so specialized in urbanism that I can bring something to the table that is an asset to not only real estate developers, but for students, people that live in Kansas City who don't necessarily understand what's happening as far as development. They don't understand what has happened as far as neglect and buildings and history and memory. All of that stuff is all tied together in my opinion. And so I create a perspective. Basically, I try to find ways to make this knowledge accessible to people. Whereas like you can find all this knowledge, but it's in a library, hidden in a book. And so like I make it accessible by putting it in music, by creating businesses, by creating opportunities, putting on festivals, stuff like that.